Leo Brent Bozell III has been confirmed as the next U.S. ambassador to South Africa. The conservative activist and media critic has pledged to advance President Donald Trump's invitation to Afrikaners who seek to flee what he calls unjust racial discrimination. He was confirmed in a block vote of 97 nominees on a party line vote. All Democrats voted against the confirmation. We're now joined by some interlocutors on this to share their insights on this. International relations expert, Professor John Strimlau, Professor of International Relations and Diplomacy Studies at the University of South Africa, the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs, Professor Anthony von Nieuwkerk, and veteran U.S. diplomat, political analyst, and founding associate editor of the Daily Maverick, Brooks Spector. Good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. And of course, the elephant in the room is about some of the comments that Brent Bozell III has made about South Africa. In fact, Brooks, I'll perhaps start with you. Profile him for us. Who is this?
All right, let's get the very latest now from our correspondent in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Peace. Sherwin, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. A very good afternoon. So the US SA ambassador finally ready to take up his duties amid the ongoing tense relations between the two states. Do tell us more.
Well, it's been quite a process, right, amidst tense diplomatic relations between Washington and Pretoria, and no reason to get into that. But also a long process here for Leo Brent Bozell III. He was nominated in March. He only got his confirmation hearing in October. And then, due to various Senate processes, was part of a block vote, a shifting of the rules in the Senate, where it allowed the Republicans to move a block of 97 nominees forward and put that to one vote. So he was confirmed in December and of course became then the ambassador designate. And then you saw that picture posted by the US Embassy in Pretoria, where he was being sworn in alongside his wife, holding the Bible, and being sworn in there by Republican Senator Ted Cruz. So the timeline, Alicia, as you well point out in that introduction, we don't know exactly when he will be arriving in South Africa. We've reached out to the presidency, we've reached out to the Department of International Relations and the US Embassy, but none of them have confirmed when he will arrive and when we will see him present his credentials to President Ramaphosa. There were some questions as to whether South Africa would, acquiesce to this nomination, and it appears, despite confirmation or lack of confirmation to that effect, it appears certainly that Bozell will be arriving in South Africa and will very likely be presenting his credentials to President Ramaphosa.
News just in fact, Brent Bozell III has been sworn in as U.S. ambassador designate to South Africa. The U.S. Embassy says it looks forward to working under his leadership to advance American priorities and promote a safer, stronger and more prosperous America through continued engagement with South Africa. We must note that he will still need to...
The announcement of a new United States ambassador to South Africa immediately drew attention from diplomats, analysts, political parties, and international observers, not because ambassadorial appointments are unusual, but because the relationship between Washington and Pretoria has entered one of its most fragile periods in decades. The timing, background of the nominee, and broader geopolitical context transformed what would normally be a routine diplomatic process into a focal point for debate about sovereignty, alignment, and the future of U.S.-Africa relations. South Africa occupies a unique position in global politics. It is Africa's most industrialized economy, a member of the G20, and a leading voice in the global south. It is also a key member of BRICS, aligning itself economically and diplomatically with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and other emerging powers. This positioning has increasingly placed Pretoria at odds with Washington on issues ranging from global governance to foreign policy alignment, particularly as global competition between Western powers and rising multipolar blocs intensifies. Relations between South Africa and the United States have historically been complex but cooperative. During the post-apartheid era, Washington supported South Africa's democratic transition, economic reforms, and integration into the global system. Trade ties expanded through programs such as the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which granted preferential access to U.S. markets for South African exports. Military cooperation, development aid, and health partnerships, particularly during the HIV/AIDS crisis, further strengthened bilateral ties. Over time, however, ideological and strategic differences began to widen. South Africa's foreign policy increasingly emphasized non-alignment, multilateralism, and South-South cooperation. Pretoria maintained diplomatic and economic relations with countries viewed by Washington as adversaries, including Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela. South African leaders framed this approach as a continuation of the country's anti-colonial and anti-imperialist legacy, insisting on an independent foreign policy that resists pressure from major powers. The divergence became more pronounced as global tensions escalated following conflicts involving major powers. South Africa's refusal to align unequivocally with Western positions on international crises triggered criticism from U.S. officials and lawmakers. Statements questioning South Africa's neutrality, voting patterns at international institutions, and participation in joint military exercises with non-Western partners contributed to a growing atmosphere of mistrust. Against this backdrop, the appointment of a new U.S. ambassador took on heightened significance. Ambassadors serve as the primary channel for diplomatic engagement, shaping not only bilateral communication but also tone, priorities, and perception. When an envoy is perceived as politically charged, ideologically rigid, or confrontational, host nations often interpret the appointment as a signal of policy shift rather than routine diplomacy. The nominee's background quickly became a subject of scrutiny. Analysts examined prior public statements, political affiliations, and positions on international issues. Critics argued that certain views associated with the nominee could clash with South Africa's constitutional values, domestic politics, and foreign policy principles. Supporters, on the other hand, contended that a firm ambassador might reflect Washington's desire to assert its interests more clearly at a time of growing geopolitical competition. Within South Africa, reactions varied across political and social lines. Members of the ruling African National Congress expressed concern that the appointment suggested a more aggressive U.S. posture toward Pretoria. Opposition parties debated whether the envoy could improve relations through candid engagement or worsen tensions through ideological confrontation. Civil society organizations and academic commentators warned that diplomacy driven by pressure rather than dialogue risked undermining cooperation on trade, development, and security. The issue also resonated within broader African diplomatic circles. South Africa is often viewed as a bellwether for U.S.-Africa relations due to its economic size, diplomatic reach, and influence within continental institutions. If relations deteriorated significantly, other African governments could interpret it as evidence of shrinking space for independent foreign policy choices under Western pressure. Conversely, a constructive engagement could signal that Washington remains willing to accommodate diverse perspectives within Africa. Washington's perspective reflected its own strategic recalibration. U.S. policymakers increasingly frame Africa as a critical arena in global competition with China and Russia. Infrastructure investments, technology partnerships, mineral supply chains, and defense cooperation have all become central to U.S. engagement strategies. South Africa's role within BRICS and its partnerships with China and Russia have therefore drawn heightened attention from American officials concerned about strategic influence. Economic considerations further complicated the diplomatic equation. South Africa relies heavily on access to international markets, foreign investment, and stable trade relationships. Programs such as AGOA provide tangible economic benefits, particularly for manufacturing and agriculture. U.S. officials have occasionally hinted that political alignment could influence economic cooperation, while South African leaders have insisted that trade should not be weaponized for political leverage. The ambassadorial appointment raised questions about how economic diplomacy would be conducted going forward. Would the new envoy prioritize trade expansion and investment, or emphasize political conditionality and strategic alignment? Would dialogue focus on mutual interests such as climate change, energy transition, and public health, or on points of disagreement such as military cooperation with non-Western powers and voting behavior at international institutions? Historical memory also shaped perceptions. South Africa's political leadership emerged from a liberation struggle that was met with mixed responses from Western governments during the Cold War. While the United States eventually supported the end of apartheid, memories of past ambivalence and sanctions continue to influence attitudes toward Western pressure. Any diplomatic engagement perceived as patronizing or coercive risks reviving sensitivities rooted in that history. The role of public messaging became another source of concern. Modern diplomacy extends beyond closed-door meetings into public statements, social media, and media appearances. Ambassadors who speak bluntly or publicly criticize host governments can quickly inflame tensions. Observers questioned whether the new envoy would adopt a low-profile, relationship-building approach or a high-visibility posture aimed at signaling Washington's priorities to domestic and international audiences. South Africa's strategic importance also lies in its regional influence. It plays a central role in Southern African development, community politics, peacekeeping efforts, and regional mediation. Any deterioration in relations with Washington could affect cooperation on regional security, conflict resolution, and development initiatives. Conversely, effective diplomacy could strengthen coordination on shared challenges such as maritime security, terrorism, and economic stability. The situation unfolded within a broader global shift toward multipolarity. Many countries in the global south increasingly resist binary alignments, preferring flexible partnerships based on issue-specific interests. South Africa's foreign policy reflects this trend, emphasizing autonomy and strategic diversity. U.S. diplomacy faces the challenge of engaging such partners without framing relationships in zero-sum terms. As discussions continued, official statements from both governments emphasized commitment to dialogue and mutual respect. U.S. officials reiterated the importance of the bilateral relationship, while South African leaders underscored their willingness to engage constructively with any accredited ambassador. Despite these assurances, analysts noted that diplomatic tone often evolves over time, shaped by events, crises, and policy decisions beyond any single appointment. The ambassadorial process itself followed formal protocols, including legislative review and diplomatic accreditation. Yet even before full confirmation and deployment, perceptions had already formed. In international relations, perception can be as consequential as policy, influencing expectations, trust, and willingness to cooperate. Media coverage amplified the debate. South African outlets examined potential implications for sovereignty and foreign policy independence, while U.S. media focused on strategic competition and ideological alignment. International commentators framed the situation as a test case for how Washington would engage African partners that resist clear alignment in a polarized global order. The outcome remained uncertain. Diplomatic relationships are dynamic, shaped by personal interactions, institutional frameworks, and evolving global conditions. An ambassador, initially viewed as controversial, can sometimes build trust through sustained engagement, while even well-intentioned envoys can face setbacks if broader policy tensions intensify. What remained clear was that the appointment symbolized more than a staffing decision. It highlighted the strains and contradictions within contemporary diplomacy, where historical partnerships intersect with new power dynamics, and where Africa's growing assertiveness challenges traditional assumptions about influence and alignment. As South Africa and the United States navigated this moment, the direction of their relationship would depend not only on rhetoric but on concrete actions. Choices regarding trade, diplomacy, security cooperation, and respect for sovereignty would determine whether tensions escalated or gave way to renewed engagement. The ambassador's role would be pivotal, but ultimately part of a larger geopolitical conversation reshaping relations between major powers and the global south.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.